Welcome back, Traveler, to the second part of 3 of the Invokation Akademy Review Session for version 4.3. Yep, they crammed so much into this patch that we're not going to be done at the end of this review. But in case you missed it, I did already go over all the balance changes and gave my early impressions on all 20 action cards added to this version. And now that I've had a chance to play with the cards, I was probably off a little bit on a few of them, but overall those predictions seem to have held up pretty well, so definitely go check it out if you haven't already done so. But today, we're going to tackle half of the new character cards, starting with the ones I've been experimenting with the most, the 5 monster cards. Like a lot of the other monsters, some of these have very unique mechanics, which also means they come with a lot of text and can be pretty hard to understand. So as usual, for each character, we'll go over their full kit, give you my impressions on them so far, and give you a deck suggestion if you want to try them out. And to kick things off and send them tumbling across the ground, we have the much anticipated Signora. Like some of the other Fatui monsters, Signora's weapon type is other, meaning she can't equip weapons, but her normal attack is Catalyst-like, dealing 1 cryo damage. Her skill does 2 cryo damage and applies a debuff to the character, which deals another 1 cryo at the end of the round. Note that the debuff does not stack, so using the skill twice will still only deal 1 damage. Her burst costs 3 cryo and 2 energy, dealing 4 cryo damage and healing Signora for 2. It also removes the Ice Seal status that she starts with, permanently transforming her into her pyro form, the Crimson Witch of Embers. And we'll cover that form in a little bit, but there's actually 2 more ways that she can transform. At the start of your round, if Signora is at 4 or less HP, she will immediately transform into Pyro, removing the status. Or if during your turn, if Signora is defeated while the Ice Seal is active, she'll instead revive with 1 HP in that Pyro form. As the Crimson Witch, her normal attack and skill are the same, but instead deal Pyro damage instead of Cryo. It's also important to note that the Pyro version of the debuff applied by her skill doesn't stack with the Cryo and will cancel it out. So you won't ever be able to combo the 2 into a melt reaction together. Her burst now costs 3 Pyro instead for the same energy, but deals 6 Pyro damage. And a final thing to note about the form, while she is transformed, she counts as a Pyro character for any effects that refer to an elemental type or the types on your team, for instance for the Gilded Artifact. Her talent card doesn't actually use any skills, but instead costs 3 aligned die and generates 3 dice of her current element, so either Cryo or Pyro, which essentially means this card will fix dice for whatever form she is in. While equipped, anytime a character deals 3 damage to Signora, she will not only reduce that damage by 1, but also apply that Cryo or Pyro debuff to the opposing character. Note, because this is the same debuff as her skill, it also won't stack with it. The talent card is actually incredibly strong, especially against decks that can only deal damage in chunks of 3 or more. Each time you get hit, if you reduce the damage by 1 and apply that debuff, that's 3 damage value worth in a single talent card, which is much higher than some other talent cards out there. It can really be a nightmare for your opponent to deal with Signora while she has this equipped. Even if you don't trigger the damage reduction, it can still be worth it, and you're not even locked into using her skill after transforming the dice. You could just use those dice to burst as well. Very flexible card and definitely worth including if you're using Signora. She is definitely one of the more complicated of the new characters, with not only 2 forms, but also 3 different ways that she can actually transform. However, it's really worth learning her kit because she is really powerful. Her skills provide an incredible amount of elemental application and combine extremely well with other summon skills that can make use of both hits like Fischl or Sara. Her bursts are also very efficient damage-wise, and to top it all off, having 2 elements built into a kit makes her deck building not only really interesting, but extremely versatile. While she may be memed on for quite some time in the Genshin community, her TCG card is not messing around and looks to be really strong. She pairs particularly well with Electro characters, as it allows you to start the game off using Superconduct, which is best when all your opponent's characters are still alive, and then once you take out 1 or 2 characters, you can transform and start triggering Overload, which is a much more efficient reaction in those later game scenarios. Another way you can try to use her is if you build her alongside another Cryo character, you actually get access to Cryo Resonance, but once you transform, you also get to have the benefit of having lots of reactions offered by having a rainbow deck. When playing against Signora, it can be really dangerous to stay on that first character when she applies your debuff, as it opens you up to many first turn kills, or just give your opponent a really efficient reaction turn. It's often best to swap off that character so you waste that secondary elemental application. Another tip to keep in mind playing against her is you'll want to avoid taking her out until she transforms. If you let her revive into the Pyro form, you're effectively giving her more than 10 HP worth of value. Remember, if she is at 4 HP or less at the start of the round, she will naturally transform and no longer revive, so try and avoid finishing her off until the transformation happens. With the power and flexibility, I've no doubt we'll see a lot of Signora, and if you want to try on a deck, I'd recommend Signora Fischl Child. Your plan is pretty simple. You're using Signora and Fischl for extremely efficient superconduct reactions at the start to deal a lot of damage, and then once Signora transforms, you get Overload and Vaporize to finish on Child as well. And because Signora and Child are both Fatui, you get access to Fatui Conspiracy, and when your deck essentially contains all 4 different elements, there's pretty much no bad element that you can roll on that card. Alright, to follow up that kick, let's stomp into our next character, Azhdaha. Azhdaha's normal attack does 2 physical damage. His main mechanic is the ability to absorb 4 elements: Cryo, Hydro, Pyro, and Electro. In each game, he can only absorb each element once, and when he does absorb an element, 2 things happen. First, you immediately generate a dice of that element, and second, Azhdaha gains a new elemental skill of that element, which simply does 3 damage. Note, unlike Signora, absorbing an element doesn't actually transform Azhdaha's type into a different one for effects like Gilded and his talent card. He'll remain Geo. The main way Azhdaha will absorb elements is his elemental skill, which does 3 Geo damage. If this triggers a Crystallize, he'll immediately absorb the element Crystallized. But if that doesn't trigger a reaction, Azhdaha instead will apply a buff to himself, and the next time he takes elemental damage of one of those 4 elements, will absorb that element, provided he hasn't already done so. His talent card costs 2 align, but will generate 1 die for each different elemental type that you have on your team. So assuming you have 3 different elements, will net you +1 die. This is pretty powerful and means you generally will want to play Azhdaha in a rainbow team rather than a resonance team. Additionally, after using the talent, he'll apply the same buff as his skill does, allowing him to absorb the next element that he takes damage from. Note that while this doesn't use any skill, it is considered a combat action, so playing his talent card will pass the turn back to your opponent. His burst costs 3 Geo and 2 energy and does 4 Geo damage base, but is increased by 1 for each element absorbed so far. You can see the total number of elements Azhdaha has already absorbed by the indicator here, so this lets you know how much bonus damage the burst will do. Unfortunately, you will have to remember which elements have been absorbed so far, as there's no indicator for that. Azhdaha is extremely unique as a character that not only can have access to 5 different elements, but also comes with potentially 4 extra dice. Also, being able to absorb elements from both your team and your opponents makes it a lot more likely you can get the maximum value out of it too. And when playing with Azhdaha, that's why you really want to run him with 2 different elements to make full use of his absorption and his talent card, both of which are very powerful. On top of that, he fills quite a lot of different roles for any deck. He's a strong anchor character, meaning a 3rd character that you use to finish games. If he hasn't yet absorbed a certain element, then by himself, he will almost always be able to guarantee getting 9 dice on that last round, which lets him use his elemental skill into his absorbed skill, finishing with his burst for a lot of damage. You can also just play him early as part of your rotations to get value from the elemental absorption generating dice. No matter what you choose to do, Azhdaha certainly appears to be solid as a rock. So a deck recommendation is honestly kind of tricky. You can really put him with any other 2 characters that work well together. He does tend to prefer characters with lots of elemental application, so once again, summon characters tend to work pretty well. So even though Oceanid was just nerfed, why not try something like Oceanid Fischl Azhdaha? This is pretty close to the Agent Electrocharge deck, but now with 2 monsters, you can make use of Abyssal Summons to make up for that Oceanid summon that is now missing. Alright, enough time on the ground, let's rise up for our next card, Thundering Manifestation. Manifestation's basic attack deals 1 electro damage. The rest of his kit focuses heavily on its lightning probe mechanic, which is the icon you see on your opponent's side at the start of the match. By itself, this doesn't do anything, but the first time your opponent uses an ability each round, it attaches a debuff to that character that stays there until a new character is locked on. While active, which is indicated by the glowing aura around it, Thundering Manifestation's attacks deals an additional damage to that character. But as long as that debuff is there, certain skills will lock onto that target and hit them even when they are off field. The most common one you'll be using is his elemental skill, which does 3 electro damage and hits that locked on target. If there happens to not be a target, it just hits the active character. The elemental burst costs 3 electro and 2 energy, dealing 2 electro damage initially, which always hits the active character, but it leaves behind a summon that deals 3 electro damage at the end of the round to the locked on target. This means that the 2 halves of the burst can hit different characters. Manifestation's talent is pretty unique in that it costs 0, and you can actually play it any time even if Manifestation is not the active character, which is not true for most other talents. It doesn't use any abilities, but when equipped, whenever any character, not just Manifestation, hits a locked on character for the first time in a round, you draw a card. Provided your deck isn't trying to use Storm Terror's Lair, this card is really good for any deck running Manifestation. Since any character can trigger the draw effect, it's really not hard to get a card each round. And even if your opponent swaps off, Manifestation skill will still be locked onto that target and still let you guarantee that card. Costing 0 dice, including this, is almost free and well worth it for most decks running Manifestation. If you remember how annoying Wanderer was when first released for being able to hit inactive characters, get ready for it all over again with Thundering Manifestation. Unlike Wanderer, however, there's no option to try and play around it even strategically by switching to a specific character. As long as that debuff is there, that character will always be vulnerable. The only way to get rid of it is to skill on a different character at the start of the round to get locked on and then swap to more important characters later, but this isn't always an option, particularly in the early rounds. Add to that the fact that Manifestation gets a free +1 damage each round from the status. You have one monster of a damage dealer. In fact, it's a lot more accurate to just think of the skill as having base 4 damage rather than 3, as you can always guarantee that hit on a locked on character. It doesn't sound like much, but it really adds up very quickly and can make it really hard to play around Manifestation. And to help dish out the pain, one of the best decks right now with Manifestation is with Klee and Bennett. Having double Pyro gives you access to Pyro Resonance, which when combined with other buffs does a staggering 9 damage with Manifestation skill. Bennett Burst, of course, is also very scary here, buffing the damage even more. If you like playing aggressive decks and taking out opponents quickly, this is definitely a great one to try, and if you want to see gameplay, I featured this recently in a Duelist Theater. And while we're up in the air, what's that over there? Is it a bird? Is it a plane? Well, it's kind of both. It's Dvalin. Dvalin's normal attack deals 2 physical damage. His first skill deals 2 anemo damage and debuffs the opponent with total collapse. The next time this character takes physical or anemo damage, it increases that damage by 2. His talent uses his skill, and while it's equipped, instead of removing the debuff after getting the bonus damage, it instead moves to the next character to the right. Do note that multiple of these don't stack, so if the next character is already debuffed by total collapse, you won't get a second use out of it. He does have a second skill, which is a prepare skill that costs 5 anemo and does 3 separate actions, much like Electrocube. The first part deals 2 damage to the active character, then 1 anemo damage to the character to the right of the active character, finishing with 2 anemo damage to the character on the left. Do be aware that if the opponent does switch characters, then the target changes as well, because it's always based on the current active character. His burst costs 4 anemo and 2 energy, dealing 5 anemo damage, but applying total collapse debuff to the characters to the left and right of the active character. The most interesting part of Dvalin's kit is definitely his prepare skill. While at its base, it's only 5 damage for 5 dice, which is really not great. The idea here is if the active character is affected by an element, then every hit in that combo should swell, assuming you're not triggering any additional reactions, which adds up to a lot of damage. Unfortunately though, your opponent is able to play around it by swapping twice to avoid further swells and have Dvalin hit the same character with all 3 hits. But that does mean they're using 2 dice to prevent this, so it's a fairly even trade. But if you manage to get all 3 swells off, Dvalin does an insane amount of damage with a single skill, particularly when combined with buffs to swell damage like Sucrose Talon or Shenhe Burst. The total collapse mechanic, however, while it sounds strong, is a lot less exciting. It's actually not that common to deal physical or anemo damage to these targets, remembering that when you swell an element, the swell damage isn't considered anemo. And even though on paper his burst technically adds up to a total of 9 damage, it is 4 cost, and because that damage is delayed and conditional, it actually isn't very effective. Overall, Dvalin really wants to be played in a double anemo deck, as this is the best way to ensure those swells from his combo, while also giving you more ways to trigger total collapse. So, one obvious deck he slots great into is Shenhe double anemo. The core of this deck hasn't changed very much, with Sucrose and Shenhe combo to buff swell damage, and Dvalin's prepare skill can leverage this even further. If you can set this up and your opponent doesn't swap out of the prepare skill, you will do an incredible amount of damage. Because of this, you'll really want to try and set up for a big turn where your opponent is out of dice and can't play around it. This is one of the few decks that really makes use of one of the new cards, Falls in Fortune, which makes it so that both players have to spend 2 dice to swap. Normally this card is pretty bad, but specifically in double anemo, there's a few tricks you have. First, using anemo resonance lets you bypass that added swap cost even after playing Falls in Fortune. Secondly, it of course combos very well with Dvalin's prepare skill, but you can also just use it with Sucrose's skill to make it much more difficult for your opponent to swap back onto a character you just swap them off of. Overall, I don't know if this deck is better than the Wanderer variant, as he does mostly the same thing but has a little bit more flexibility in how you use your skills, but it's still a ton of fun and definitely one you should try out if you like Dvalin or double anemo decks. Finally, let's land on the last new monster card, Scorching Loremaster. Her normal attack deals 1 pyro damage. Her skill is pretty simple, also doing 3 pyro damage. Her burst costs 3 pyro and 2 energy, dealing 2 damage initially, and leaving behind a summon that does 1 pyro damage with 2 usages. Additionally, while this is active, it'll absorb 1 damage each round, but only for the Loremaster. Her talent uses her burst and increases the summon's damage by 1 if the Loremaster has used a normal attack or an elemental skill. On top of this, the damage reduction now works twice around. With the damage bonus being conditional and the shield really only effective on Loremaster, it's actually not very worth using, and I'd avoid using the talent card. She does have a passive ability where the first time she drops down to 7 or less HP in a match, she'll immediately gain an energy. Note that if this happens when she's already at max energy, the passive won't trigger, and you will be able to trigger it again later if the conditions are met. But even with this, unfortunately, Loremaster is definitely the weakest monster card released. While her passive does usually let her burst right away after using 1 skill, the burst itself is balanced by being fairly weak, particularly since you need to stay on Loremaster to take advantage of the damage reduction, which means you're not really making use of the additional pyro applications. Overall, you're really incentivized to start on Loremaster in the first round so you can build up to a burst right away after using a skill. But in games where your opponent doesn't deal 3 damage to you in that first round, things get really awkward. You don't really want to use another skill and miss the passive, but then you're probably going to need to swap to another character anyway. She is a little comparable to Dea, but rather than being able to protect other characters, she only protects herself, which really limits her flexibility. And because her kit is a little defensive, ideally you want to play her in a stall deck, but Pyro as an element is not well suited to doing that either. If you do want to give her a try, I'll tentatively recommend Raiden, Loremaster, Nahida. The idea here would be to start on Raiden Summon and then go to Loremaster and use her skill, and hopefully by the start of the next round you'll have taken enough damage to burst right away, and then you can try and use Loremaster to tank a bit while the summons and Nahida seeds do some damage. Overall, this deck isn't really better than versions that use Shanling, so I wouldn't really recommend playing Loremaster right now. We might have to wait and see what Eremite Resonance will be to see if she is worth running at all. And we made it to the end of all the new monster cards. Hopefully you now have a better understanding of how all the cards work so you can more effectively play with these new cards and build decks around them. There is so much to try out in the set. Don't forget we still have 6 more characters left to talk about, but that will have to wait until next time. If you are a newer player, be sure to attend the TCG 101 series to level up your Genius Invocation game. If there's anything you'd like to see in an upcoming video, drop a comment and I'll see how I can help. Be sure to enroll in our courses by subscribing so you can be notified when a new lesson's available. Until then, class dismissed!